This is the Peddler of Swaffham. Now, a peddler is a sort of shopkeeper, but he can't afford a whole shop. So he or she, because you can have lady peddlers, of course, carries all their goods in a big bag or big baskets. If they can afford a donkey, they put it on the back of a donkey. Otherwise, they have a big rucksack that they carry everywhere, and they go from door to door. And this peddler liked selling pots and pans, and he was good at mending them too. And everybody liked him, and he worked very hard. And he had a lovely wife he adored called Katrina, and 3 beautiful children. Well, this peddler, his name was John, went to bed one night and snuggled next to his wife and started to dream. And in his dream, a man in a dark red coat came and said, "John, you've got to go to London, and you must go quickly. And when you get to London, you must go to London Bridge and wait there. And if you do, then good will come of it." Wow. John the peddler sat up in bed and rubbed his eyes and thought, "This is very strange. What an odd dream." Rubbed his eyes again and thought, and went back to sleep. And he was fast asleep. And the man in a red coat stepped into his head again and said, John the peddler, wake up. I want to tell you, you must go to London. You must go straight to London Bridge, and you must do it as soon as possible. Don't hesitate, because if you go now, then great good will come of it." Well, John woke up a second time, and he thought, this is weird. And he didn't want to wake Katrina up, so he started to go downstairs, and she went, "Oh, John, where are you going?" And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, darling, I was trying not to wake you." And he sat on the edge of the bed and he told her about the dream. "Oh, it's just a dream," she said. "Go back to sleep." But he couldn't. So he went down and sat by the fire and brewed himself a hot drink and sat and thought. Nobody in his family had ever been to London before, and he'd no thoughts of going. What would he do in London? Well, dawn came and Katrina and the children came down, and they said, "You do look tired, Dad." And he told them all about the dream. And they said, "London? That'd be really exciting to go to London." And he said, "Yes, but it'd cost a lot of money and I need to work." And then Katrina said, "Why don't you go and talk to the priest, because he's a wise man. Tell him about your dream. Perhaps it's got some meaning you don't know about. And then perhaps maybe you could come to some conclusion about what it means. Perhaps it is something important, but perhaps it doesn't mean quite going to London, because that's a strange thing to do." And so John went through the village until he came to the church, and he found the priest in the church up a ladder with hammer and nails and bits of wood, and he was trying to mend the church roof, which got a big hole in it. Such a big hole you could see the tower through the roof. And John looked up and said, "May I borrow you a minute, please, Father?" And the priest was glad of a break, because he wasn't very good at nailing, came down and said, "What do you need, my son?" And John told him all about the dream. And the priest laughed and he said, "Dreams are useless, dear boy. What do they achieve? We need practical realities. We've got to mend the church roof before the whole church falls down. If you can think of some way of doing that, I'd be grateful. But as for dreams, I'm afraid they are just dreams." And so John said, "Thank you, Father," and he went home. All day he worked, but he couldn't get rid of the memory of his dream. That night he went to bed, and as soon as he was asleep, there was the man in red in his head. He was so real, John could almost have touched him. And the strange man said, "John, in the morning you must go to London. You must do it straight away. Do it, and great good will come. If you don't go, you will always regret it, I promise." In the morning, Katrina went downstairs first, and John followed, yawning and scratching his head and scratching his back. And Katrina looked at him and he looked so grey and worried. She said, "Did you dream that dream again?" "Yes," he yawned. "What do I do?" And so she went to a pot on top of the cupboard, and from it she drew a handful of silver coins, and she put them on the table and said, "I've been saving for years, just a few pence here and a few pence there. This is my emergency fund. I want you to take it, and I want you to go to London, because you won't be at peace unless you do." "Do you mean it?" he said. "You don't mind?" And she said, "Well, you're of no use until you've been, are you? You'll always be worrying about it." Just then the children came in, and Katrina and John explained that Daddy was going to London for a few days. "Come back soon," they said, and they gave him big hugs and kisses, and he hugged and kissed them back. Then he took everything out of his big pack, all his cooking pots and all his mending things that he carried everywhere he went. And in the pack he put a blanket and a mug to drink out of, and then Katrina gave him 2 loaves of fresh bread, a pie, and a bottle of homemade cider. And he kissed them all, and he set off down the road to London. Now there were no trains or buses in those days, and he couldn't afford to buy a place in a coach with horses. He had to walk. It was a good 5 days' walk, at least 100 miles, if not more. So he walked, stopping once or twice to eat a bit of bread or to drink some water from a well. And when night came on, he was in a dark, lonely heathland. There was no barns around to sleep in, no inns, no farmhouses to beg a bit of shelter from. So he curled up in his blanket under an old oak tree and tried to get some sleep, although all night he was terrified that wolves might come. But he was in luck. No wolves did come. And in the morning he woke up, finished off the first loaf of bread, and started walking again. Day after day, until at long last he came to London. Well, London was a big, strange place. He'd been to Norwich once, and this was bigger than Norwich. The roads were crowded, and the roads stank of poo, because people didn't use toilets. They used to just use a potty and fling everything out of the windows. And horses dropped all their poo too, so it was very stinky and full of flies. And he walked on, and he asked people where London Bridge was, and eventually he got there. And it wasn't like he'd imagined. And if you look at a picture of London Bridge now, it wasn't like that at all. If you look on the internet for an old picture of London Bridge as it was in the Middle Ages, you'll see it had houses on it and shops. It was almost like a little town all on its own. Well, John was a bit worried about sleeping rough out here, so he used some of the precious money to buy a room in a very cheap inn, but it was still more than he could afford. In the morning he went to London Bridge, and he looked around and he thought, "Now I'm here, what do I do?" Because the dream hadn't told him what to do, but just to come here. So he looked around, and so he thought, well, perhaps if I walk up and down, and perhaps the man in the red coat will come. So he walked up and down the bridge, up and down, and it wasn't that big. It only took 10 minutes to walk from one end to the other. And he began to talk to people and said, "Have you seen a man in a bright red coat?" "No," they said. And then he started peering in shops to see if any of the shops gave him ideas of why he ought to be there. By the end of the day he was tired. He spent a bit of money on food, because he'd eaten all the bread by now and the pie, but he just didn't know why he was there. And he began to feel worried and frightened. Had he done the wrong thing? Well, he spent the night in the inn, and all day the next day he walked up and down, and a third day he walked up and down. And at the end of the third day he looked at his money, and he knew he couldn't spend any longer there. So as the afternoon wore on, he thought, "Unless I find something or someone in the next hour or two, I'm going to turn round and go home. I've got to be out of London before nightfall. I can't afford another hotel. And then he thought, there's got to be something here that I've missed. And then he turned around and almost bumped into a man in a red coat. But it wasn't like the man in the dream. He had been quite good looking and with a neat beard, and his coat had been clean. This was a very scruffy, ugly-looking man with a scrubby beard, and his coat was covered in muck, yesterday's dinner and all sorts of nasty bits and snot on the sleeves. And then behind the man he saw a huge black bear. It was a big, ugly thing. Now he'd heard bears dance, and he was looking at this bear in amazement, wondering what you did to make them dance. And the man in the dirty red coat said, "What are you staring at?" And John the peddler said, I was just looking at your bear. Will it dance for me?" "If you give me gold," he said. But of course John just put his hand tightly around the money he'd got in his pocket and shoved it further in his pocket. He'd got so little, and he said, "Well, perhaps another day." And the man said, "Well, stop bothering me and clear out of my way." And John stepped back. This wasn't the man from the dream. So he picked up his rucksack and decided to walk off the bridge and go home. It had been a waste of time, useless. And just as he was about to step off the bridge, a short, bald man came up to him and said, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Well, John was an honest sort of chap, and he said, "Well, I'm a peddler, and I had a dream." And he told the man about the dream. And the man just threw back his head and roared with laughter. "Dreams," he said, "tish-tosh, load of nonsense." "Why do you think that?" said John. "Well," said the man, "only a night or two ago I had a dream about a place called, what was it now? Swaffham, that was it. I mean, stupid name for a town. It probably doesn't even exist, but I knew it was Swaffham in my head. In this town there was a garden, and in this garden there was an old hawthorn tree. You know, the sort some people call it May. It gets covered in creamy blossom at this time of year. And next to that tree, under its roots, there was a big pot of gold. Now, isn't that ridiculous? That's the stupidest dream I've ever dreamt." John opened his mouth and then shut it again. He wanted to go, yes, but he had to keep his mouth shut. It was his secret. So he said, "Yes, that is indeed a funny dream." He was trying very hard not to smile. And he said, "It's been lovely meeting you, and I'm going right back home now." And then he turned and he walked away, trying ever so hard not to punch the air and dance a jig as he went. Well, he managed to reach the edge of London before nightfall, and he begged room in the stable, where he snuggled down in the straw as happy as anything. Well, next morning he walked and walked and walked as fast as he can, and in 5 days that evening he was back in Swaffham. And his children ran running to meet him, saying, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy, you came back." And Katrina came out, wiping her hands on her apron, and she hugged him and hugged him. "Oh, I've missed you so much," she said. "And I've missed you, my love," he said. And they all went in, and Katrina gave him supper, and they sat by the fire, and he told them everything that had happened. Well, it was almost dark, but you can imagine they couldn't wait. They got spades and shovels, and Katrina and John and the children all went out, because in their garden was a big old May tree, and at this time of year it was thick with creamy blossom. And they dug and they dug and they dug, and they shifted the earth and they moved it aside, and it was almost too dark to see, and Katrina went in and got a lantern, and they kept digging until John's spade went dong. "We've hit metal," they said, and they kept digging and kept scraping, and there was a lid, and they lifted the lid, and in the lamplight they picked up a handful of gold coins. It's true. The children ran in and they got buckets and baskets and they put all the gold coins in there and took it back into the house. And then in the dark they scraped around the pot and lifted it up and carried that inside. Well, they counted the coins. There were hundreds of them, hundreds and hundreds. And Katrina looked at the pot and she said, "That's a very fine pot with a good lid. I could do with that for making stews." "Well, you're welcome to it," said John. And he just rubbed at it and he said, "But it's got writing on it. Before you start cooking in it, I'm going to take it to the priest because he'll be able to read it. I'm dying to know what it says." "Oh, it probably says belonged to John Smith or something," said Katrina, and they laughed. But that night they went to bed and slept so soundly. And in the morning, John washed the big pot and he carried it through the village and he called on the priest who was once again in the church trying to mend the roof. And he said, "Father, what does this say?" And the priest came down the ladder and said, "That's funny, it's in Latin and it says, 'Under me is one richer than me.'" "Where'd you get it?" "Oh," said John, "I just dug it up in the garden." And then he looked up at the roof and said, "I'll come and give you a hand with that later." "Oh, thank you," said the priest. "Now I'm going to get this bit up because it's going to rain later." And John went home, and instead of going back to work, he got a spade and he told Katrina what the writing said. And they dug and they dug and they dug, and very soon there was another dong, but a bigger one than last time. And they lifted up the lid and inside there was more gold. Well, they'd emptied out all the buckets and baskets and brought them back and scraped everything into them, and they took it into the house. And once more they hauled out the great big pot, which was a big enough cauldron for Katrina to do her washing in. And they filled in the hole, said thank you to the hawthorn tree, and they went in and they counted the money. There was so much. John sat and thought, and he said, "Call the children, Katrina. I want to talk to you all." So the children came in and their eyes almost popped out of their heads when they saw how much gold there was. And John said, "We've been very blessed and we've been very lucky. So I suggest we take out enough money to look after ourselves until we're all old, and that we give the rest of the money to the priest, because he can mend the church with it and share out the rest amongst the poor of the village. And then everybody gets a blessing. Everybody gets to share." And the children jumped up and down and clapped their hands and said, "Give, give, give, share, share, share." And Katrina kissed John and said, "I'm glad I married a good and generous man." John washed his hands and put on clean clothes, and he went back to the church and he said, "Father, I know I promised to come and help with the roof, but I would be very, very grateful if you could help me with something first, and then you will have all the help you need." The priest sighed and looked at the hole in the roof, and he followed John all the way back home. Katrina welcomed him and gave him a hot drink and a sandwich, and they led him into the back room where the floor was covered with gold. The priest almost dropped his bread and cheese. "Where did you get that?" And John told him the whole story, from the dream and going to London Bridge and digging, and then what was written on the pot, meaning that he dug further and got more. "Now," said John, "my wife and I have taken out what we need to look after ourselves until we are old. But we want to give the rest of the gold to you to mend the church and share with those who are needy in Swaffham." Well, the priest couldn't believe it. He fell down on his knees and he said a prayer of thanks. And he said, "Tonight, come to the church, for we will have a party." "A party?" said John. "I didn't think you approved of such things." "Tonight," he said, "I do." And they had the best party that Swaffham had ever seen.